This is Rescued, a Black romance short story, written by R Leonard, narrated by Kimberly Yvonne Steele. Prologue. The late cold night sent shivers down her spine and threatened to cause her joints to stiffen as she took each step forward. Her eyes almost clamped shut from swellings, and she was barely able to see the dim light ahead. It was the only thing she could rely on. Her slender-framed arms were numb with pain. Her back threatened to betray her, and her spine weakened from excessive blows and trauma having been dealt to it. Her slender frame threatened to get carried away by the wind as the nightly air grew fierce and unforgiving. Standing at no more than 5 feet and 3 inches, and yet with a domineering stature that tallied with her personality, she was indeed hard to miss. Sadly, it wasn't the sort of night she had envisioned, and it wasn't the sort of life she had hoped to have. A young brown-skinned Black woman, battered and looking weary, walking along the bridge by herself in the dead of the night was a dangerous affair, yet she'd rather be there than back at home, where she called hell. I gave him everything, she thought to herself. She was certain she had given him everything, from the moment they met up until he struck her repeatedly with a stick. Making it out of the house was nothing short of a miracle, and now standing atop the bridge where he had proposed to her was even more heartbreaking. The bridge, which used to stand as the symbol of their love and the intent to begin life together as a couple, was now nothing but a sad reminder. Sheila lowered her head, felt her dark and lengthy hair fall on either side of her face in pain, and wept bitterly, clenching her fist into balls as she moved closer to the railings on the left side of the bridge. Her intent was to stand right atop where he had knelt to propose to her, look back at how happy she was at that moment just a year ago, and then go ahead with her net plan. Yet, walking from her home, which was about a mile away, dressed in her nightgown and shuddering at the cold and immense pain she had suffered, wasn't the easiest thing to pull off. With each step taken, she cursed her luck and wondered why she had to have suffered so much. She cursed and swore and prayed at the same time, to no avail. He'll change. She had recited to herself many times over the past year since she moved in with her man. He's under a lot of stress and would change. Those words had become a theme song, and she would sing it to herself every blessed time he struck her and tried to appease her with a hug or a kiss. It was something she badly wanted to believe, and one in which she had willed and conditioned herself to key into. "You two are engaged but not married," her friends would remind her. "He hasn't even married you yet, and he treats you this badly?" Their anger and sentiments weren't lost on her, but she wanted to believe otherwise. After all, he had come off as a knight in shining armor, and everything about him was top-notch. His care, his affection, his understanding. Well, everything felt perfect for the first few months into him proposing, before she began to see the dark side to his personality. Drunk episodes and late-night brawls with friends and acquaintances had become the norm, and any motion she made to try and bring things to order would result in her being beaten, abused, and humiliated, not just behind closed doors, but outside where friends and strangers would bear notice. The latest episode, leading to her lengthy walk and soul-searching in the dead of the night, had been triggered because she brought him to order about his flirtatious nature and infidelity with women whom she had found out about. "It's none of your business, Sheila," he had screamed, initially turning around and walking away. Sheila had assumed that was the end of things until she saw him storm right back with a stick in hand and anger sprawled across his face. She had barely seen him raise his hand before heavy blows landed on her body and caused her to pass out. Waking up bloodied, drenched in sweat, and on the front lawn of their home, surrounded by dirt, had driven an inner sense of turmoil more than anything she had ever experienced. Sheila simply upped herself from the dirt, and without dusting herself clean, muttered to herself, "I cannot take this anymore." Those words propelled her through her journey back to Plymouth Bridge, where everything had begun and where she hoped everything would come to an end. "I'm sorry," she muttered to herself, closing her eyes as she felt her lungs suck in some cold and stinging air before struggling to exhale as one broken rib prompting so much hurt from her chest. She drew closer to the protective railing and stared into the dark seas around before sighing aloud and slowly making her way atop the railing. Feeling freedom within her grasp and life behind her, Sheila played everything she had had to suffer in the hands of her man through her head before deciding it was the best possible thing she could do for herself. In that moment, she had struck rock bottom, and there was just no denying it was a fact. Beads of tears rolled down her cheeks in an endless stream, and her soul wailed along with her. "I'm so sorry," she said one more time before leaning away from the railings and hoping gravity would do the rest. At 25 years of age, and with so much about the world still out there for her to explore, Sheila would have chosen another option, if there was one. She was certain he would find her, and there wasn't going to be any escape. With a subtle push, she urged her body away from the safety of the railings by the bridge and towards the dark seas beneath. Sheila Daniels hoped and prayed for God to forgive her for trying to take her life, and in hopes she would no longer have to suffer in the hands of any man. Her trust and belief in men ended from the day her fiancé decided to strike her, and her ability to love had died over the past few months. Her body dove downwards, and she closed her eyes, waiting to embrace death and hoping it would be quick, too. It was her one way out, or at least it was what she thought. Sadly, her body rammed into the waters below the bridge, and her consciousness slowly fizzled out too, and with it went her pain, for the first time in a long while. 15 minutes before, Michael Richards held his hand firmly atop his steering wheel and continued to peer into the night, wondering and hoping he could go along with his plan. His phone light popped on, as it had done for the umpteenth time within the past hour since he got the quite devastating news. "No, no, no, no!" he had screamed, staring at the mail indicating his company was about to get closed by the government for reasons he just couldn't quite make out. It was his life's work and everything he had placed his hopes on since he was 18. Now 29, and looking back at the sleepless nights, the business plans, and hurdles he had to endure and surpass before establishing himself as one of the youngest and most driven successful business moguls of his time. "They're shutting me down?" Michael Richards recited to himself as he felt a sting of pain tear through his heart. He revved his engine some more, ground his teeth, and steadily went through everything coursing through his head. He wasn't going to be the first to run his car over the railing and into the waters beneath the bridge, and Michael knew he wasn't going to be the last. With no light at the ends of his tunnel, and almost as though there was no hope in sight, Michael Richards lowered his head to sob bitterly. Slowly raising his head, a slender framed figure traipsed by, bruised and dirtied, with similar sobs escaping her lips. Her ebony-rich hair caught his attention, while her gracefully covered backside seemed to trigger his interest some more. The moonlight lit amidst the skies, bounced off of her hair, and then illuminated her face partly as well. It was safe to say she bore immense beauty, even while she looked battered and injured. Frail-looking, troubled in how she crouched and giving him enough to feel worried about, he wasn't quite sure he could sit there and let things get out of hand. He watched the brown-skinned young lady walk over to the bridge's railing before halting for a moment as her cries littered the night. Her majestically long legs in full view, but he willed his focus away from them momentarily. While she wept, he found himself hurting for her. His pain seemed to fade away, and slowly got replaced by hers, prompting him to lessen his grip around his steering wheel and for him to turn off his car. He watched her dearly and in serious concern. "Walk over and help her," he heard his thoughts ring aloud. Shy, unsure of what to do, and still struggling with his challenges, he shoved his car door open, slammed it shut, and began to approach the lady. Within 10 feet of her, Michael Richards felt his heart leap towards his mouth as he watched the lady climb atop the rails and edge herself towards the sea below. He took to his heels, waving his hands wildly, but in what appeared to be rather too late. "Oh my God! Oh my God!" he screamed, feeling confused and unsure of what to do within the next minute. He raced back to his car and called 911 for help before racing back to the scene and taking off his shoes immediately. Time was of the essence, and something about the lady plunging into the seas beneath had stirred his heart in a manner he couldn't quite explain. Michael Richards climbed over the railings and plunged into the seas, where he could see the drowning lady waving her arms and splashing as she fought to be alive. "Please don't die," he recited to himself as he felt his body free fall and splash into the waters underneath. Unsure of what would become of himself or the lady he was trying to save, Michael Richards held on to her and wrapped his arms around her, hoping and praying that help would arrive soon enough. Chapter 1. Slowly parting her hazel-colored eyes and barely able to contain the amount of light rushing through, Sheila squinted and groaned a bit before turning her head to the side. She locked gaze with a pair of deep brown and beautiful-looking eyes and a wild smile like nothing she'd ever seen before closing her eyes and wondering if she had awakened in heaven or some kind of joke was being played on her. The last of her memory equipping her with was her body breaking through the water and splashing into the seas beneath the bridge. Her consciousness had faded away, and waking up in a nice room with a dark and sandy brown-haired fellow with intoxicatingly piercing eyes staring right back at her was somewhat disturbing. His sharp and perfectly chiseled jawline was prominent and couldn't have gone without being noticed. An aura of calm came with him, while she could tell he was someone of worth. Sitting underneath his chin was a well-carved mustache, linking perfectly around his lips and adding beautifully to his already mesmerizing aesthetics. "You're awake," the freakishly handsome fellow with tender tone muttered. The baritone with which his voice resonated caused her to halt her breath momentarily while she clenched her fist tightly, wondering if it was all a dream. Sheila managed to keep a straight face and a blank expression as she gawked at the heavily built fellow whose biceps ripped through his shirt and threatened to burst through. His perfectly lined lips seemed to bear a beckoning appeal, and his African-American alluring-shaped face only brought her comfort the longer she stared at him. He grinned from ear to ear and slowly leaned into his chair before letting off a subtle groan. Sheila looked around the room, noting she was in a ward of some sorts, with medical equipment hanging around the corners of her room. "You look even more beautiful than you did the previous night," the man complimented her, prompting Sheila's face to hold a thin smile before it vanished hurriedly once again. "Where am I?" she heard herself try to ask, but to no avail. "How did I get here?" Her words remained within her head, and her voice continued to fail her. Her larynx felt too weak to function, and the more she tried to speak, the more pain she felt coursing through her windpipe. "I should get the nurses." The man seated not far from her slowly got up with the sling around his arm as he smiled at her once again. Rising to his feet, towering in height, and no less than being 6 feet and 2 inches, she marveled at his stature, and yet felt herself grow some worrisome thoughts as to what he was doing in her room. He reached for his crutches and helped himself up before disappearing from the room for a moment. Sheila trailed him with her eyes, admiring his perfectly carved buttocks and how chunky they were. Tall-framed, Obviously about 6 feet tall and with stunning physique, she found herself pondering about him for a while before slowly easing her gaze away. Sheila sighed in relief while she scanned through her room for clues on and about how she had landed there. Flowers littered the room with get well soon cards with the name Michael Richards scribbled into every one of them. Michael Richards? She thought to herself, finding it impossible to relate the name with anyone she knew. The room door slowly creaked open, gaining Sheila's attention, as a nurse walked right in with a smile on her face. "You're awake," she muttered, before checking Sheila's vitals. "He really did wait until you were awake." "Who did?" Sheila asked, still realizing her voice really wasn't coming out yet. The nurse assessed her body some more before slowly drawing back and bobbing her head. "You're definitely fine, and your injuries are healed up, but you'll be here for the next few days for us to be certain about everything before we let you go," the nurse explained. "Mr. Michael Richards already paid for your medical expenses, and since we didn't have anyone show up for you, he signed the waiver to be your guardian too." Sheila felt some relief wash through her, and a mix of curiosity too. "Who's Michael Richards?" she meant to ask, as she smiled for the first time, and in a weak manner too. Almost as though the nurse had heard her hearty questions, she replied, "In case you're wondering, he's the reserved, doting, and dark-skinned, handsome-looking fellow who has spent the past 2 weeks sitting by your bed, even while he sustained some injuries while trying to save you on the bridge." With the explanation made, she turned away and exited the room. Sheila turned her head to the side and wept dearly. She didn't know what to make of such a man. It was unlike anything she had ever received from a man, let alone one she didn't know and who didn't know her or have the obligation to stand by her or do anything for her. "Hello." A subtle tone she had heard before called out from the door. "Do you mind if I come in?" It was the dashing black man from before, with wavy-looking hair and an aura of affection in his tone, as well as his facial expression. Sheila cocked her head and invited him in, as she watched him slowly walk up to the seat he had occupied before, planting himself into it in a familiar manner before picking up a novel he had been reading before she awakened. "Thank you," she heard herself mutter weakly, in what was the first time her voice would actually come through since she regained consciousness. Michael smiled, bobbed his head, and drew closer to her. "Would you love me to read to you?" She nodded her head happily, while the duo shared the moment without knowing too much about each other yet, but also knowing they felt at peace at that very moment and in each other's presence. 6 months trickled past for Sheila and Michael Richards, and the world only continued to feel brighter for the duo. In duet, they had grown through the past months together, 2 Black couples, loving life as one and exploring their new realities in ways they never would have previously envisaged. For Sheila, it was nothing like she had ever experienced in her life. Having a 30-year-old African-American man dote over her wasn't something she was used to, and judging by all she knew about Michael, he seemed different in countenance and personality as compared to other men she had been with. His touch was gentle when they visited the beach, or when he held her hand while they shopped, while everything about him seemed to ease her storm every single day. While they weren't dating, things had obviously begun to progress, and hence the reason why she was rushed out of her house while she glanced at her watch and hoped she wasn't running late. Michael had asked her out to dinner. While it wasn't the first one they would be having together, he did seem rather excited when he spoke with her on the phone. More so, she'd been thinking about him right from the moment they shared a kiss, which was just weeks past. Sheila had initiated it, and she was gladdened to her soul that she did. His lips had threatened to melt between hers, and his breath warming her brown skin was even more alluring than she could have hoped or even imagined. She recalled the kiss as though it was just happening all over again, and almost as if she could taste his cherry-flavored pear between hers. He was an excellent kisser, with a firm grip gently cushioning her neck while he pulled her closer to his body. Sheila had wanted to taste more of him on that day, and she wanted to have more, but things felt like they were on the verge of moving too fast. While they pulled away and ended the moment abruptly, she had spent the following nights dreaming about him and a whole lot of things that could come with them being together. She had fallen head over heels for Michael, but remained unsure of what was keeping him back from opening up about how he felt. He's shy, she thought to herself, and concluded, before slipping into the limousine waiting in her driveway to take her to their assigned spot. Her heart began to beat in excitement, and she could barely control her thoughts. Pains from her past had fizzled away, and everything had to do with Michael walking into her life and literally diving headfirst into the sea to save her life while sustaining injuries of his own. "We've arrived, ma'am," the chauffeur announced before stepping out of the car to help Sheila with the door. Sheila stepped out, donning a freakishly short black gown, just as Michael often said he liked, and with his favorite purple lipstick smearing on her lips. Bearing a confused expression on her face as she stared at their date venue being an art gallery, she wondered if she had been brought to the right venue. The walkway, lined with red carpet, had people standing on the flank as they escorted her into the building. Her heart lost its beat as she walked into the gallery to see Michael, looking absolutely dashing in his black suit and blue tie. "I thought you said we were having dinner," she inquired with a raised brow. Michael shrugged and answered, "Yeah, I did say that, but I lied." Michael looked stunning, dressed in a blue-colored tuxedo and sharply polished black shoes. Everything about him screamed out as he stood before her. His dreamy and intense eyes stared right back at hers, while her hazel-colored pair sunk into his. Wearing a stoic expression, she fell silent as Michael stood akimbo. "On this day 6 months ago, I was on the verge of losing everything," he explained. "I was sure I had lost everything, and then a beautiful black diamond saved my life on that bridge where I was hoping to ram my car into the railing and overboard." Sheila shook her head. "You saved me, and all I did was rack up medical bills on you." Michael interjected as he approached her and took her hand into his. "No, you saved me, and in so doing, I got way more than I could ever wish for. I gained a friend, a black diamond, and a gem, and above all, a woman I have fallen helplessly in love with since I first laid my eyes on her." He turned to look at the gallery and then back to Sheila, with their eyes sinking into each other's, as Sheila felt her toes begin to grow restless and her knees threatening to wobble. Something about his touch seemed to set her loins on fire, and she could swear she felt droplets of juice slowly begin to crawl down her thighs. "I won my case against the government as regards keeping my company going, and it was no mean feat," Michael continued. "I was down, beaten, and hopeless until you stood by my side and came into my life. It also helped that the local news captured our story about the entire bridge incident." He wrapped his arms around her, and Sheila reciprocated the gesture as her eyes slowly began to let off beads of tears. It felt amazing to be regarded as part of the reason for his good fortune, in difference to what her ex would often label her to be. According to her ex, she was the reason for every downfall that befell him, and there was no end to the mental torture and accusations. "As appreciation to and for everything you've done for me, this gallery belongs to you and is fully paid for in your name and is due to open whenever you decide it would," Michael whispered into her ear. Sheila shrieked aloud with joy as she pulled away to look in his eyes. She kissed him all over his face and raced around the floors in joy without knowing how to best contain or entertain her happiness. Owning a gallery was always her dream, and she recalled only mentioning it to Michael once when they were still in the hospital recuperating. Hands clamped atop her face as tears came flooding through. She turned around to thank Michael some more, but felt her eyes widen and her jaw drop as the man had gotten on his knee with a large diamond-encrusted ring in his hand. "Will you do me the honors of becoming my better half, Sheila Daniels?" he asked with glee in his eyes and a measure of certainty in his tone. Sheila rushed forward, fell to her knee as she held out her finger for him to slide the ring onto. Barely allowing the diamond ring to sit perfectly around her finger, she pulled Michael closer and locked her lips with his dearly. She wanted nothing more. "I want you right now," she muttered. It was all she could harbor in her head. It had been a while since she had been with a man, and more so, one she felt her heart beating for and her soul becoming infatuated about. Chapter 2. Michael had insisted on having a nice dinner with Sheila before the night got any older. Through their meal, she had barely kept her eyes off of him, and he did the same. Her black skin shone brilliantly against her gown, and her lavender perfume continued to trigger an endless stream of naughty thoughts while he gawked at her. They dined with joy and smiled and laughed their way through it until it was time to leave. The car ride finally came to an end, stopping before Sheila's apartment. "Care for some coffee?" she asked the dashing man seated to her right. Michael looked at her with a grin and replied, "It is long overdue." The two exited the car, bearing excessive and continually growing tension between them. They walked through the lobby holding hands before standing before the elevator meant to convey them to her room, which was some floors above. Sheila tapped her foot into the floor nervously, taking glances at her watch until the elevator doors finally parted open to grant them entrance. "After you, darling," Michael said with an extended arm, like a gentleman. She purred and walked ahead, while she could swear she felt his gaze peeling away at her behind. The elevator doors slowly shut after Michael stepped in and stood on the opposite side of the wall to Sheila. The air grew thin between them and continued to get thinner as the whirling sound of the elevator moving soon kicked into gear. With a quick lean forward, Sheila met her lips with his. Michael leaned forward as well, meeting her halfway to assist the notion she had etched in her mind there and then, after previously conceiving the thoughts on how his lips would taste all through the night. "Did I ever tell you how badly my dick aches for you?" he asked, while their lips remained locked. "Well, what are you going to do about it?" she asked in tease. She reached for his clean-shaved face and ran her fingers down his chin before setting them atop his ripped chest. Easing her way underneath his shirt, she fondled his nipples and smiled right back at him as she watched his entrancing pair of eyes flicker in the same manner as her hazel pair. They both were at that point, and it wasn't hard to tell how badly he wanted to devour her. Without further introduction, the inner beast Sheila had tried desperately to tame came alive, shoving Michael backwards against the inner wall of the elevator as their makeout session got intensified in passionate kissing and handling. She reached for his already stiffened dick as she felt it harden some more underneath her grip, as she savored the sweet taste of his lips. "When do I get to taste this?" she asked. "How long will you keep me waiting?" Michael ran his hands along her slender waist, slowly cupping her round breast before moving towards her armpit. He lifted her gently from underneath, groping her buttocks in his hand in a seductive manner that sent Sheila's body shuddering under his manly touch. Gently and gracefully, he lifted her up, just so she'd attain the same 6 feet in height as him, with a seductive grin and his beckoning lips, getting ready to deal her some much-needed pleasure. He worked his way gently from her lips to her neck, before placing her gently against the wall, where most of the magic was to begin. He slipped his hand underneath her dress, contacting her bare and full-feeling left breast. She had had no bra on, as her nipples stiffened badly immediately as he multitasked by slipping his other hand underneath her partly up skirt to meet with her already flooded underside with wetness. Sheila let out soft gasps and moans as her body had begun shivering under his touch. She felt herself explode from the inside as he suckled on her right nipple, leaving the left one to crave for dire attention from him. Determined to have a feel for herself, she shoved him backwards and hard into the wall before crouching and leveling her face with his crotch. "Babe, don't fucking stop," he commanded. "Don't you fucking stop." He wasn't beyond spilling out commands, and she wasn't beneath answering them either. Michael clamped his eyes shut, imagining the warmth he was about to receive from her mouth, as she kept true to his thoughts and yanked his stone-hard dick in her hand. Sheila looked up in tease, gently licked his cock cap before swallowing the shaft until she was on the verge of choking. He held her head in place and into a firm motion that best suited her action. Her head bobbed atop his cock until it was wet and extremely hard at the same time. "Suck my balls," he commanded, feeling Sheila reach underneath his shaft to hold his pear in her hands. She toggled with the pear, rolled her tongue towards the sack, and suckled on it, while Michael moaned aloud and banged his fist into the wall in response to how good her mouth worked. Michael redirected the elevator back up just as it came to a halt down the building. He had other things in mind as he waited for the chime that indicated they had gotten back to their floor, before sweeping Sheila off her feet and muscular lift, before dashing towards her room. Unlocking the room wasn't in any way difficult, even though they couldn't keep their hands off each other. As they found themselves inside, without recollection of how they had gone past the door, she ripped his shirt off in tenacious strength, revealing his sexy abs, just as he tenderly eased her dress off, her light brown and somewhat chocolate skin. He dropped her gently into the soft embrace of the couch, where he planned to have her. Time had moved fast past them, without a care in the world between them both. His storm tempered without ease as he parted her equally wet vulva, penetrating her without mercy, just as she had imagined it all through the night. In sweet moans of ecstasy, Sheila gripped Michael's back, digging her fingers into his flesh as he rolled her without stopping, further pounding her till her eyes rolled back in her head, with the threat of her brains exploding as he consumed her with his sexual prowess and domination. Sheila had given up on keeping how she felt locked up inside, as sweet screams bellowed from beneath her belly, out into the room, and surely past the door, and hopefully into the hearing of her neighbors, just as she hoped it would be. Her inner beast was being tamed by this seductively handsome man, whose eyes shone with wild intent as he turned fixated his gaze on her, as he pounded her madly, as she ran her hand through his hair, the moment he bent her over to dig his teeth into her neck, before transforming it into soft, sensual kisses that seemed to set Sheila's soul ablaze, just as her vagina was at that moment. The couch wasn't going to be enough for them, and he lifted her in his arms, carrying her towards the bedroom until they were in the embrace of the mattress underneath them. Michael could feel the softness of her lips as it threatened to tear away as she kissed him passionately in return and shyly while she made certain to return it kindly. He worked his lips around her neck, to her left ear, nibbling on the lobe, till Sheila had begun to squeal in uncontrollable wiggles, with her body began aching for more touch, and rather less shy from how it was. His tongue trickled its way down her chest, licking away at her melanin-toned skin, as he gently shoved her top away to partly reveal her nipple. Slowly and seductively, he began nibbling on her nipple, from the right one gaining most attention, while the left one remains without any. It was almost too much for Sheila to bear as she moaned softly under his touch. Sheila squirmed under his touch, but in a good way, as she sat up and held his hands in her face. She jolted his chest forward, pushing it against his head, while her fingers dug into his hair desperately as she tried to hold on to something. Demanding to take better control, he gently tilted Sheila to her backside, feeling her lavender scent permeate his airways before desperately helping her out of the gown she had donned for their dinner as he kissed her tenderly. Their tongues locked as Michael multitasked, getting her top off, cupping her huge breast and cherry-like nipples on them. With no further invitation, he plunged his head towards them, kissing the parting between her breasts tenderly before working his hands on the breasts themselves. He massaged the nipples with masculine feel until they grew rock solid, with Sheila letting off moans at all intervals, indicating Michael was doing the right thing. Her absent dress revealed the G-string she had worn underneath as he gently made his way with tender kisses from her chest, down her navel, and further down in between her legs. "Oh, Michael, now you want me to get all naughty," Sheila warned, feeling his tongue begin to work its magic around her clitoris. Her body shivered as he intensified the workout with his tongue in between her legs. Michael felt his mouth gulp a salty taste from the secretion Sheila had begun letting off from her vagina as she got badly turned on. He felt her shudder every time he licked her vulva, taking timely pauses before plunging his tongue deep into her again. His penis had gotten hard enough to permeate anything as it poked Sheila's leg, as she did nicely to take note as well and massage it tenderly with her legs underneath Mike's feasting of her vagina. She could feel herself explode every time, with juice passing out of her clit and into her vagina-eating companion's mouth. Slowly peeling his warm mouth away from her loins, he crawled up and towards her upper body so she could gawk at his perfect black and toned skin. His protruding third leg slowly snuck its way between her thighs and rubbed against her warm skin until she could feel Michael centering it into position. "I want you," she whispered in a rather seductive tone. "I have always wanted you, from the first time we kissed," she confessed. It was the same for him, even though he was often too shy to speak out or acknowledge it. Her body was perfect beyond measure, and every time he thought of the curves that came with them, he found himself lusting beyond what he could control. "You can have me," he muttered in reply with a smile. Sheila braced herself for what was to come, and Michael didn't disappoint in any way. He parted her thighs with both hands, centered her into position, and slowly unsheathed his shaft into her. Sheila gasped and felt a subtle moan escape her mouth before clamping her hands over her lips. Michael was a sexual machine in ways she had not initially thought or even assumed. He worked her in every angle, hitting the right spot and making certain she was unable to spill or spell her words out correctly. He pounded her hard and right, alternating between slow moves and rapid ones before dropping her and bending her to the touch of her toes. She could feel her insides explode as Michael took charge and never seemed to want or intend to ease off. Like a caged beast just granted freedom, he rammed her hard, slapping her ass till it became red to the tender screams that skipped past her mouth. "Fuck me good," Sheila asked further, still finding words difficult to complete. "Fuck me like you never want me to leave." He obliged, alternating between fast and subtle strokes, prompting melodious tones to emanate from Sheila's lips. Her pussy aided his shaft with ease, with her juice guiding him without stress, in and out. Each stroke prompted Sheila to clamp her fingers into his ripped chest, while she leaned forward to bite his nipple as best as she could. His large dick was in tune with his body size, and the way he worked his tool in and out of her was no different from a man who had mastered the art. Sheila screamed atop her guts and yelled as though she was on the verge of passing out. "I want this every fucking day," he declared. "Yes, yes, yes, you can have it," she stuttered, as she felt him drive her even harder than he had been doing some minutes back. Michael halted, exited his dick from inside her freakishly wet vulva, flipped her around, and placed her on her knees, before guiding himself back in. Sheila groped the sheets tightly, bit her lower lip, and filled the air with her melodious screams. Her sweaty, melanin-fueled body bobbed forward and backwards, in tune to the rocking effort of the gracious and powerful black man pounding her hard from behind. The blue-rimmed moon shining brightly from outside the window bore witness to what was bound to be a stunning night for the duo, with tales to be told in the morning. Deep in love with each other, and with the world still a fearsome place to navigate, Sheila gave her all to Michael, who did the same without holding back. It didn't matter if her ex still existed, or if he would bring them torment. She wanted Michael, and he needed her in his life. It was all that mattered for the black couple. It was all they needed. Her moans tore through the night and continued late into the early hours of the morning, as the two sealed the deal into what would be a happy life for them in the end. This has been Rescued, a Black romance short story, written by R Leonard, narrated by Kimberly Yvonne Steele. Author bio. R Leonard is a Black man with a passion for writing heartfelt and heated romance and erotica. He refuses to use a pen name because he's proud of his work. He's a fan of creating that first spark between characters that turns into a blazing fire. While he's aware he's not the typical romance author, he's bound and determined to make a name for himself and shoulder in among the greats as one of them. When he's not writing, he's thinking up new story ideas. Motivated by the real world, he writes realistic, down-to-earth stories designed to captivate readers. He also enjoys playing sports, expanding his mind at museums, traveling far and wide, and working out. He strives to be an inspiration to others, afraid to be true to their passions, and hopes to become an accomplished writer. For business inquiries, contact him at jrbigrep@gmail.com. His readers are more than welcome to contact him also with questions or thoughts. In due time, he also plans on becoming a film director, shooting independent movies that include the White Slave Woman movie series, along with many of his other books to come. So if any actors or actresses are out there, contact him. Experience or no experience needed. All people are welcomed. Color or race don't matter. Please consider sending him a cash donation to help him bring out more great content. His PayPal email payment is jrbigrep@gmail.com, or you can Cash App him at $bigrep2. Thank you all so much.